G'day, freedom lovers of North Queensland. Mark's here with another stunning interview. Today we have Daina Webb, a former teacher who lost your job, I believe, due to vaccine mandates.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about how that went down. Like, you were a teacher of 30 years.
Yep.
You're there in the classroom one day and what happens?
Yeah, well, there was a bit of build-up to it, wasn't there? 30 years. I did 20 years in New South Wales and moved here to wonderful Townsville with my husband as defence. In 2011, I did 10 years at Heatley High School and recently moved over to a private Christian school here in Townsville. Last year was my first year at that school. My children attended the school, had been attending the school for years. I'm familiar with the staff, familiar with the parents, familiar with a lot of the kids. So it's a very community-based school. You feel it's, an extension of, as a Christian, extension of your church and your home, and it's that kind of community. So when the mandates went down and we realised that our beautiful little Christian community school was going with the mandates and the government against, I don't know how to say it, everything that you feel as a Christian, as a human being, you should not treat people a certain way. So when we realised that our lovely Christian school was agreeing with the mandates, there were 15 of us in the school that had some concerns, and we approached that in various ways however we felt. I personally felt like I needed to go and speak to the board. I crafted a letter that had outlined all my reasons why I believe an independent Christian school that we pay substantial fees to, why are they kowtowing to a government that, really they should have nothing to do with? So that was a bit of a shock. 15 of us were stood down, pressure was put on.
When you say pressure, what kind of pressure? Perhaps victimised in a sense? You're targeted because of your stance? Had you made your stance clear to the rest of the staff?
Yes, and it was around the time that the digital identity was, or the plans for the digital identity were being released. There was an option where we could have our say in a petition against the digital identity. So that was sort of part of the package that I was bringing to the teachers.
Good old helicopters flying over. Hopefully that's not mucking our audio up too much, but that's what you get in a military town.
Yeah, that's right. So I sort of used that as an opening to speak to my colleagues. I said, look, this digital identity, this is where it's all leading. I said, it's not just mandates, and it's more than that. You can see that there's a plan. If you go on the World Economic Forum websites and all of that, it's written clear as mud in black and white for anyone to access and be aware of what the plans are and where this is all heading.
Yeah, it's clearly not a conspiracy theory.
So I started with the digital identity and explained all that, and of course we don't know what's going on. But going into when you walk into a staff room, which is a safe place, you don't expect a group of teachers in a very loud voice to say, "Oh, this is all happening because there's some really selfish people who don't want to protect all of us as a community." Everyone just has to get the jabs so that we can all be protected. It's just because of the selfish people, the people who don't have any consideration for other, the whole story.
Yeah, the same old insults.
I'm the type of person where you can't say that. You can't say that to people.
Yeah.
You can't force people. You can't coerce people. And people's medical, because we're talking about a medical procedure, effectively.
And an experimental one at that.
An experimental one. And it's still experimental, and people don't realise that it is still a trial.
Yeah.
You can't force other people, and you have no right to comment on anyone's medical status. You don't know their history. You don't know what they've been through. You don't know anything, and nor should you.
Well, it's protected under the Privacy Act.
Correct. And I would say that to people too. So they didn't like it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I see in one hand they're kind of adhering to mandates, which are not laws, and violation of clearly made laws. You know?
Well, there was a lot of that virtue signalling going on as well. You know, remember Facebook or the status, I've got mine, you need to get yours, I've got mine, I've done the right thing.
Yeah, virtue signalling has been quite a problem with a lot of things, you know, I think. And in a lot of ways, the virtue signalling sort of army is sort of, I think, been built up for this sort of purpose, you know, to get people to, you know, ridicule others rather than stop and think and have an open discussion like we are now.
That's right. And virtue, it's not a gift of the spirit. It's not something that's epitomizes holiness and goodness. It's the exact opposite. If you're virtue signaling, you're bragging and coming from a place of I'm better than you.
Yeah, it's a place of vanity.
Yeah.
Which I believe is one of the 7 deadly sins, isn't it?
Yeah.
Being vain.
So I'm going back to school. Yeah, it is. Going back to the school, I sat down with the board. I approached the board with a letter. I sat down with the principal and the exact same thing, the outline of what I believe from our Christian school, how they're treating people was wrong. Like I said, and when it comes down to it, it's money, it's greed. And I was told blankly that if we don't agree with what the government's doing, they'll take their funding off us. And
So,
that's a basic common denominator, I think.
So your higher-ups are saying that they're going to lose their funding if they don't comply, and that was their justification.
Australian government funding, if they don't comply with the mandates, they'll lose their funding. But we're talking about an independent private school that have a lot of parents paying substantial fees for that exact reason, to be away from the government and away from state schools. So when you pay extra for a service, there's certain expectations that come with it.
Yeah, definitely. So are you aware of how much government funding goes into a private school?
No.
Right. And one must wonder at this point, you know, when the government is providing so much funding, how private is that school?
That's right.
You know,
that's a whole new issue. I think that was hard for a lot of us to reconcile with, just that fact that yes, we go to a private school because we don't agree with what the state's doing to our children. So we pay a lot more for that privilege, so you have a lot more expectations. And for a school to just operate under the mandates the same as the government schools was hard to take.
Yeah.
It was very disappointing.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking. And what went with that then was the Great Divide. Families, staff, students, even the older ones, the seniors that were making choices themselves and had concerns about the vax. You couldn't even discuss it with students.
So were you instructed not to discuss it with the children?
Yeah.
How did that conversation go down?
It was the principal who came. He said he had a complaint from a parent about my political views in the classroom. And I said, can you specifically tell me what I said that was wrong and what, because as teachers, you're very careful not to talk about anything contentious anyway. He couldn't tell me what it was, couldn't tell me who made a complaint. And my response was like, just broadly, I'm very careful what I say.
So it was almost like a wild, unfounded accusation with no support and perhaps fishing for a response.
I think that's exactly what it was. Yeah.
Could you recall having ever said anything at all of that nature to warrant such a conversation?
No, the only thing I ever say to any student, and this is on any issue, if we're talking about palm oil and, you know, deforestation or anything like that, I always tell the kids, you've got God-given intelligence and a keen mind, go and do your own research. Right? And this day and age of information and technology, you can find information anywhere.
Oh, it sounds like you were definitely one of the good teachers in the... We've lost a great resource for our youth, because I remember as a student, it was very rare that you come across an intelligent teacher that would say something like that. Most of them are just reciting things out of a book blindly without thinking.
That's what the curriculum's done to students and individuals now. You could see the change 15 years ago. You could start to see the change in the curriculum, the dumbing down in the curriculum, where it's basically rote learning, and you spoon feed them a lot of the time. All teaching to assessment, teaching to tests, teaching to Nat Plan.
As a parent, the whole Nat Plan thing was a big concern to me, where every 2 years, 6 months of the curriculum seems to be dedicated to how to fill out an exam. I mean, what are they learning? How is that going to feed a child? Like, oh, look, I can tick these boxes. Like, is that the kind of society we're going through?
That's exactly what they're doing. Yeah. And it's all political too. When I was on the marking team down in New South Wales when Nat Plan first came out, and the very first test they gave students was incredibly hard. It was grammar, it was proper grammar, and at a really high level. The next year, of course, then what happened is politically, they threw a lot of money into literacy, numeracy. They created literacy numeracy teams to go into schools and rewrite programs and things like that to teach directly to Nat Plan. And then the very next year, the Nat Plan test, I was marking it, was easy. So what happens if you sit an exam that's really hard? Your levels are down here, you get probably a D, E level, and the next year you sit an easier one and you've got A's and B's, and put 2 and 2 together. Yeah. The government's, we did it. Yeah. Look at us. We fixed numeracy and literacy.
Yeah. The mandate thing has obviously been a bit harsh. So you're experiencing ridicule and whatnot. So what happens next?
What happens next? We made it to the end of the school year. So they let everyone finish off the year, like they usually did, and then it was well known that by a certain date before term 1, everyone had to have the second jab. Queensland Education created a task force called the COVID Compliance Team.
COVID Compliance Team. Yeah, okay. Do they come around in little black suits with SS written on the shoulder or anything?
Sounds good, doesn't it? How would you like a job being part of the COVID compliance team?
You got to wonder what goes through the person's head when they say, oh, I'd like to take that job.
Sizable workforce too. So their sole job, the COVID compliance team, was to make sure that every Queensland teacher had been double jabbed before they started term 1, 2022. That process was long and convoluted too. As you know, you might have known Red Union. Red Union sprouted up, and from my understanding, the easiest way to simplify it is basically a team of lawyers, it's not really a union, that helped teachers negotiate the legalese of all the paperwork. Because we had to give a risk assessment, we had to do a risk assessment paperwork, then there was a show cause letter, the show cause of why you chose not to participate in the trial and get the jabs. After that, if they didn't agree with whatever cause you gave for not doing it, they would terminate people. So what people don't realise is that a lot of teachers had already been terminated. So when they lifted the mandates and said, welcome back, a huge percentage of the workforce had already been terminated.
Right, yeah.
So to be welcomed back in the classroom, they then have to go through the re-employment process, re-register through the teachers' union, which is another interview, or the paperwork, a physical, or your documentation. They'd have to redo all of that.
So you've got to do a physical to be a teacher.
Yeah.
I've seen some bloody huge teachers. I can't imagine them running on a treadmill to prove that they're physically fit.
I think now what it is just a GP, okay. So you just go to your GP and they're like, you're physically okay to fit to work. Yeah. I think that's what it is these days.
So it's not like,
it used to be,
do 10 burpees and all that sort of.
No. So that's a huge tragedy. It's not just we've decided that everyone can teach now and it's a low risk work setting. everyone back. No, there's a huge percentage of the workforce that was already gone through that termination process.
So you were straight out terminated, you weren't put on hold or anything like that?
I personally was doing casual work. Like I said, I just left a full-time position in a state school to teach at the school where my children went to, a private Christian school.
Okay, so you didn't have
in
job
that transition
security.
process, I just chose to do relief.
Yeah.
I didn't want to take on contracts. So I was just doing a lot of relief work. But what happens then is they just don't call you.
Rightio. So
You're
you're
off their
technically
list.
still on the books, but
My capacity at the school as a parent, I was also on the PNF, the Parent and Friend Association. That's volunteer, and we used to have a meeting once a month. We'd organise things like I did a trivia night for fundraising for the school. We do bush dance, we do like mufti days, all sorts of fun things that we'd organise. It's basically a fundraising thing and a fun arm to help support the teachers, and a way for parents to be involved in the school as well through the PNF. So I'd been doing that for 6 years. I was quite active in the PNF. When the mandates went down, because even though it's a volunteer position and you don't get paid, because it's a school position, I was not permitted on campus in any capacity for PNF. So I was informed not to come on campus, so I couldn't attend the meetings and I couldn't help with all the events. My children were also in the musical, and I was helping with rehearsals, costumes, props, sewing costumes, making props.
and this is volunteer work.
This
at
is volunteer
point?
work as well. So I'd go up and I'd be with the rehearsals, because my children were there as well, painting props, making costumes, collecting, going around to garage sales and collecting things for the musical. Again, as a parent, I was allowed to still go onto school property to attend rehearsals.
Right.
As a teacher on the same campus, in the same facility, I was given an email saying I'm not allowed on campus and cannot be employed.
Okay, so this is a really interesting scenario you've brought forth, where you're allowed to go in there in a personal capacity. So if you say, hi, I'm just a mum, I can go to school.
Yeah.
But if you say, hey, I'm a teacher, that's it, get off, your trespassing sort of thing.
Correct.
That is madness.
And to the point where PNF, it's a volunteer position, but a school-based position.
Yeah.
So because of that, I wasn't allowed on campus wearing that hat either.
So you weren't allowed to volunteer.
I wasn't allowed to volunteer.
But you're allowed to go in and collect the kids.
I'm allowed to go in to collect the kids. I'm allowed to
Right.
talk to my, in the classroom, teachers. I'm allowed to go to their musical rehearsals. I'm allowed to make the props. I'm allowed to spend my own money on buying all the stuff for them.
Well, it's very kind of them to allow you to spend your own money
Right.
now that they're not going to employ you.
But this was last year. The musical just happened recently. So end of last term, when they were getting prepared for everything, I got a phone call saying, can I please drop the props and costumes off to the car park 5 o'clock Friday afternoon?
Right.
Like a criminal.
So only to the car park.
Yeah, where
So-
someone would meet me at the car park, and which didn't make sense because obviously I was allowed there, but because I wasn't allowed to be employed, because I wasn't allowed to continue with PNF, I said to them, I'm not going to be contributing to your musical. If I can't do these two roles, it makes no sense that I'm allowed on the same campus, but not allowed to earn a wage and not allowed to support my children's teachers through PNF. So I'm not going to be doing the musical. They didn't say anything, didn't hear from them. Just when they were preparing for the musical, got the phone call, can you please drop all the stuff off that you've been making and building and collecting and buying for us? 5 o'clock Friday afternoon, someone will meet you at the car park.
So how do you feel when you get that sort of thing? Like, I mean, I'd be fuming.
I just said, no, thank you.
So that's a very diplomatic response. So did you want to get into how that makes you feel, like, or a bit touchy?
It's how does it make you feel? It's a whole gamut of emotions, isn't there? I think the sheer lunacy of the whole situation is gobsmacking, and you can't justify it.
Yeah.
So it's amazement
Yeah.
beyond belief.
It certainly doesn't make much sense, does it?
No sense whatsoever.
Rightio.
And in the end, it's such a tragedy because it's the children that miss out.
Yeah.
It's the children that are being affected by all of this.
And they were just playing games,
Yeah.
you know, to try and coerce
That's
people
right.
into partaking in a medical experiment.
So that situation was no words.
Yeah.